The air hung heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth as Mike Turner adjusted his pack. August in Wyoming, the sun, already high in the sky, promised another day of relentless heat. He took a deep breath, the familiar mix of anticipation and excitement tingling in his veins. This was his sanctuary, the wilderness. Fitzpatrick Wilderness, a sprawling expanse of jagged peaks and dense forests, was his chosen battleground. He'd conquered these trails before, each step a testament to his endurance and skill. This time it was a 60-mile loop, a 9-day solo trek that would test even his seasoned abilities. By his side, his loyal German shepherd Andy whined with eagerness, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the dusty trailhead sign. Mike checked his gear one last time. Compass, map, extra supplies. He'd meticulously planned each day's route, marking coordinates to check in with his wife Diane via satellite phone. He was a man of precision, a man who respected the wilderness and its capricious nature. He knew the risks, acknowledged the ever-present danger that lurked beneath the beauty. But this time, a strange premonition tugged at the edges of his mind. He pushed it aside, choosing to trust his instincts and his years of experience. He patted Andy's head, a silent promise of adventure and companionship. With a final glance at the familiar trailhead, Mike turned and stepped onto the path, the wilderness swallowing him whole. Days bled into one another, a tapestry woven from the rhythm of his boots against the hard-packed earth, the sun's relentless glare and the icy chill of mountain streams. Each day brought new challenges, but also a sense of profound peace. The wilderness was both his adversary and his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself and find himself all at once. Mike moved with the ease of a seasoned hiker, his body a well-oiled machine honed by years of wilderness treks. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. He had learned to read the land, to anticipate its moods and whims. Andy, his constant shadow, navigated the terrain with equal grace, his keen senses alert to every rustle and scent. The bond between man and dog was unspoken but palpable, a silent understanding forged through countless miles and shared hardships. The route was challenging, the terrain unforgiving at times, but Mike met each obstacle with quiet determination. He relished the struggle, finding a strange comfort in the physical exertion and the mental focus it demanded. He was a man who found solace in the struggle, in pushing his physical and mental limits. The mountains were his proving ground, a place where he could test his mettle and emerge stronger for it. But as they climbed higher, the air grew thin, the landscape transformed into a desolate expanse of rock and ice. The ice proved treacherous, each step a potential hazard. The higher they went, the more the mountain seemed to resist their presence. Andy, his paws raw and bleeding, began to falter. The once sure-footed dog now stumbled, his energy waning with each passing hour. The sight was a stark reminder of the harsh reality of their journey. Mike watched, his heart clenching at the sight of his loyal companion's pain. He knew Andy would push on if asked, but the thought of causing him further suffering was unbearable. The bond they shared was too strong to ignore. He knew the risks of deviating from his planned route, but the thought of pushing Andy further was unbearable. The mountain had already taken its toll, and Mike couldn't bear to see Andy suffer any more than he already had. His decision was swift, instinct overruling logic. He couldn't leave Andy behind, and he couldn't continue on the current path. The choice was clear, even if it meant venturing into the unknown. He would find a safer path, even if it meant delaying his journey. The safety of his companion was paramount, and no summit was worth the price of Andy's well-being. He traced his finger across his map, his brow furrowed in concentration. The new route would be longer, more circuitous, but it offered a chance to avoid the worst of the ice and give Andy a fighting chance. There, a series of switchbacks that would lead them around the worst of the ice field. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option available. The switchbacks would be less direct, but they promised a safer passage. It was a gamble, venturing into unfamiliar territory, but one he was willing to take for his faithful companion. The unknown path held its own risks, but the thought of Andy's suffering made the decision clear. He hoisted his pack onto his shoulders, his gaze meeting Andy's. The dog looked up at him, trust and loyalty shining in his eyes. Mike felt a surge of resolve. They would face this new challenge together. "We'll find another way, boy," he murmured, his voice firm despite the unease gnawing at his gut. The journey ahead was uncertain, but with Andy by his side, he knew they could overcome whatever lay ahead. The detour took them through a labyrinth of towering pines, their branches interlocking to form a dense canopy overhead. The forest seemed almost alive, whispering secrets through the rustling leaves and the occasional creak of ancient wood. Mike and Andy, his loyal dog, moved cautiously, their senses heightened by the eerie stillness that enveloped them. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, the silence broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional screech of a hawk circling high above. Each step they took seemed to echo in the vast emptiness, a reminder of how isolated they were in this dense wilderness. The forest floor was a tapestry of fallen leaves and twigs, a testament to the cycle of life and decay. They emerged from the forest into a desolate landscape, a jumble of boulders strewn across the mountainside like discarded toys of a giant. The sudden change in scenery was jarring, the lush greenery giving way to a harsh, rocky terrain. The boulders, some as large as small houses, created a maze that seemed almost impossible to navigate. The sun beat down mercilessly, the air shimmering with heat. The once cool and shaded forest was now a distant memory as they faced the relentless glare of the sun. The heat waves danced on the horizon, creating mirages that played tricks on their eyes. Mike scanned the area, his gaze searching for a clear path through the boulder field. The terrain was treacherous, each step a potential hazard. He had to find a way through, not just for himself but for Andy, who relied on him for guidance and protection. It was slow going, each step requiring careful navigation. The rocks were uneven and slippery, making progress painstakingly slow. Mike's muscles ached from the effort, but he pushed on, driven by the need to find a safe route. He paused, allowing Andy a moment to rest in the meager shade offered by a towering boulder. The dog panted heavily, his tongue lolling out as he tried to cool down. Mike knew they couldn't afford to rest for long, but he also knew the importance of giving Andy a break. He pulled out his water bottle, offering it to Andy first. The dog lapped gratefully, his tail thumping a steady beat against the dry earth. Mike watched him with a fond smile, grateful for his loyal companion's presence. The dog lapped gratefully, his tail thumping a steady beat against the dry earth. The simple act of sharing water was a reminder of their bond, a silent promise to look out for each other, no matter the circumstances. As Mike screwed the cap back on, a flash of movement caught his eye. His heart skipped a beat as he turned to see what had disturbed the stillness. Andy, his attention captured by a scurrying marmot, had darted after the creature, disappearing into a narrow crevice between two boulders. Mike's heart leapt into his throat as he watched his loyal companion vanish from sight. "Andy?" Mike's call echoed unanswered. The silence that followed was deafening, each second stretching into an eternity. He scrambled towards the crevice, his heart pounding in his chest. The fear of losing Andy drove him forward, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "Andy, come here!" His voice, sharp with worry, bounced off the silent stones. The echo seemed to mock his desperation, amplifying his fear. He peered into the narrow opening, his heart sinking. The darkness within the crevice seemed to swallow all hope, making it impossible to see where Andy had gone. The crevice, barely wide enough for the dog to squeeze through, extended deeper than he could see. The thought of Andy trapped in the darkness filled him with dread. He called again, his voice laced with growing desperation. Each unanswered call chipped away at his resolve, the fear of losing Andy becoming more real with every passing second. A low whine, muffled by the surrounding rock, was his only response. The sound was faint, but it was enough to give him a glimmer of hope. Panic swelled in his chest, threatening to overwhelm him. He had to stay calm for Andy's sake, but the fear was almost paralyzing. He had to reach Andy, but the narrow opening seemed to mock his attempts. The rocks were unyielding, and his hands scraped against the rough surface as he tried to widen the gap. Desperation fueled his efforts, but the crevice remained stubbornly narrow. Desperation fueled his efforts. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground beneath him conspired to hold him back. His breath came in ragged gasps, the thin mountain air doing little to fill his lungs. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief, but he pressed on, driven by a primal need to survive. He tried squeezing through the opening, but his larger frame wouldn't budge. The rocks seemed to close in around him, a vice tightening with every attempt to move forward. His clothes snagged on jagged edges, tearing fabric and skin alike. The more he struggled, the more the rocks seemed to grip him, as if mocking his efforts. He wedged his shoulders in, ignoring the scrape of rock against flesh, but it was no use. He was trapped. The pain was sharp and immediate, but he forced it to the back of his mind. He had to focus, to find a way out. The thought of being stuck here, alone and helpless, was too terrifying to entertain. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at the edges of his composure. His heart raced, pounding in his chest like a drum. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, a cold reminder of his growing fear. The world around him seemed to blur, the edges of his vision darkening as the panic threatened to take over. He yelled for Andy, his voice hoarse with fear and exertion, but the only response was the echo of his own despair. The mountains seemed to mock him, throwing his cries back at him with cruel indifference. He shouted again, louder this time, but the result was the same. Silence broken only by the sound of his own labored breathing. He took a step back, forcing himself to breathe. Panic wouldn't help. He needed to stay calm, to think clearly. He closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on the rhythm of his breath. In and out, slow and steady. He could do this. He had to think, to find a way out. His mind raced, sifting through possibilities. There had to be a solution, a way to free himself from this rocky prison. He couldn't afford to give in to despair, not yet. He assessed his surroundings, his gaze scanning the unforgiving landscape. Every rock, every crevice, every shadow held potential clues. He had to be thorough, to leave no stone unturned. His life depended on it. The boulder field stretched out around him, a jumbled mess of rock and sky. It was a labyrinth of stone, each boulder a potential obstacle or a possible escape route. He had to navigate it carefully, to find the path that would lead him to safety. The sun beat down relentlessly, amplifying his sense of isolation. The heat was oppressive, sapping his strength and clouding his thoughts. He could feel his skin burning, the sun's rays a constant reminder of his vulnerability. He reached for his backpack, his fingers fumbling with the straps. His hands were shaking, the adrenaline making it difficult to perform even the simplest tasks. He needed water, food, anything to keep his strength up. It was wedged tight against the rock, pinning him further. He pulled at it, trying to free it, but it wouldn't budge. The frustration was overwhelming, a bitter taste in his mouth. He couldn't afford to lose his supplies. They were his lifeline. Fear, cold and clammy, tightened its grip. It was a constant presence, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He had to fight it, to keep it at bay. He couldn't let it take over. He tugged at the pack, his movements growing more frantic. It wouldn't budge. The more he pulled, the tighter it seemed to get. He was running out of options, and the realization was terrifying. He was trapped, his lifeline just out of reach. The backpack, so close yet so far, was a cruel reminder of his predicament. He could see it, almost touch it, but it might as well have been miles away. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the boulder field, a chilling realization settled upon him. Night was coming, and with it, the cold. He had to find a way out before darkness fell. He was alone, injured, and trapped in one of the most unforgiving landscapes imaginable. The vastness of the boulder field, once a testament to nature's grandeur, now felt like a prison. Every shadow seemed to hide a new threat, every sound a potential danger. His meticulously planned trip, his confidence in his abilities, all of it seemed woefully inadequate in the face of his current predicament. He had prepared for so many scenarios, but not this, not being trapped, alone and helpless. Fear, no longer a fleeting visitor, took up permanent residence in his gut, twisting and churning with every labored breath. It was a constant reminder of his vulnerability, a shadow that refused to leave. He had to find a way out to survive. But as the darkness closed in, hope seemed to slip further and further away.